The fog hung thick on the streets of Paris, as dense as the mystery that was about to unfold. In the shadow of the Quai des Orfèvres, Inspector Maigret lit his pipe, the embers glowing like the last flickers of a fading truth. It was a world steeped in whispers, where every step on the cobbled streets echoed with secrets better left unsaid. The night air was filled with the low murmur of the Seine, the quiet hum of an evening on the edge of revelation. And just beyond that veil of mist, something dark had stirred, a death that would send ripples through the underbelly of Paris. But Maigret, with his slow, deliberate gaze, knew this was no ordinary case. It would take him to the edges of a world few dared to look at, the world where a killer might leave behind only pieces of a truth too ugly to face. Before we dive deeper into this gripping case, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world as we explore the shadowed streets of Paris together. The rain had been falling since morning, a fine drizzle that blurred the outlines of the city and left the pavements glistening under the yellow gaslight. By the time Inspector Maigret stepped out of the Quai des Orfèvres, the clock above the old courthouse had just struck 6. Paris was sinking into one of those damp evenings when the smoke from chimneys mixed with the fog off the Seine, and even the carriages seemed to move more slowly, their wheels hissing on the wet cobblestones. Maigret drew up the collar of his heavy coat, his pipe clamped between his teeth, and started toward Rue des Martyrs, where the body of an unidentified man had been found. The telegram that morning had been brief. No signature, no name for the victim. Male, approximately 40, found dead in room above Café Lamotte. No visible wounds, no identification. It was the kind of message Maigret had received hundreds of times in his career, and yet, as the carriage turned into the narrow street, a feeling of unease settled over him. Perhaps it was the silence that seemed to hang over that stretch of Montmartre, or the faint light flickering in the upper window of the café where 2 uniformed constables stood waiting. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of stale beer and damp wool. The café owner, a short, nervous man with thinning hair, stood behind the counter, wringing his hands. He kept glancing toward the staircase at the back, as though the mere thought of the room upstairs made his stomach tighten. "He came in 3 nights ago," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Asked for a room. Said he needed somewhere quiet. Just for a few days. Paid in cash. Didn't give a name." Maigret nodded and began his slow ascent of the stairs, the wood creaking under his boots. The door at the end of the narrow corridor stood ajar, and a single kerosene lamp burned on the table inside. The room was small, barely enough space for a bed, a chair, and a cracked mirror on the wall. The man lay on the bed fully dressed, his hands folded neatly on his chest, as though he had prepared himself for the end. His face was pale but calm, the features those of a man who might once have been distinguished. Sharp jaw, neatly trimmed moustache, but the life had been drained from him. "Heart failure?" one of the constables muttered. But Maigret said nothing. He walked slowly around the bed, eyes taking in every detail. There was a half-empty bottle of wine on the table, 2 glasses, one used, the other untouched. The clock on the mantel had stopped at 10:47. There was a faint mark on the floor near the door, as if a chair had been dragged. No papers, no wallet, no suitcase. Only a few coins and a matchbox in the man's pocket. He turned to the constable. "Who found him?" "The maid, sir, came to clean the room this morning. She said the door was locked from the inside." Maigret knelt beside the bed, looking at the man's hands. There were no signs of struggle, no bruising, no indication of poison. And yet, something in the stillness of the room felt wrong. It was too orderly. Death rarely arranged itself so neatly. He looked again at the two glasses, then at the faint scent that lingered in the air. Not wine, but something more subtle. A woman's perfume, faint and powdery, like lilac. "Get Dr. Paul from the district," Maigret said finally, "and send for Janvier." While the constables went about their work, Maigret remained by the window, staring down at the street below. A few pedestrians hurried past under their umbrellas. Somewhere nearby, a piano played softly. The world went on, indifferent. But in that small room, a man had died without a name, and Maigret had the distinct feeling that his death was not meant to be understood easily. When Janvier arrived, he brought the rain in with him, shaking it from his coat before stepping closer to the bed. "Looks peaceful enough," he said. "Could be suicide." "Could be," Maigret murmured. "Except for the second glass and the clock." Janvier frowned. "The clock?" Maigret pointed. "Stopped at 10:47, but the maid says she found the body around 8 this morning. If the spring had wound down, it would have stopped hours earlier. Someone stopped it deliberately." "Why would they do that?" Maigret took his pipe from his mouth and stared at the still figure. "To fix time," he said. "To fix it at the moment they wanted us to believe he died." Dr. Paul arrived soon after, his bag heavy with instruments and his face half hidden by his scarf. After a brief examination, he straightened up. "No external wounds, no signs of violence. Could be a cardiac arrest, though the pupils suggest something else. Possibly morphine, but I'd need to confirm. Was there any sign of injection?" "None that I can see. If he took it himself, he knew what he was doing. If not—" The doctor trailed off. "Well, you'll find out soon enough." Maigret nodded absently. His gaze had fallen again on the mirror. It was cracked from corner to corner, a thin white line running through the reflection of the lamp's flame. He moved closer, inspecting the surface. The glass had been cleaned recently, but there was a faint fingerprint smudged along the edge. Small, delicate, almost certainly a woman's. Outside, the fog pressed against the window pane, making the world beyond seem distant and unreal. Somewhere below, the sound of footsteps echoed and faded. Maigret lit his pipe again, filling the room with blue smoke. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "He wasn't alone last night." Janvier glanced up. "You think the woman killed him?" "I think she was here when he died, and she left before dawn." There was a pause, the only sound the ticking of the doctor's watch as he noted his findings. Then Maigret asked the question that always came when he stood before the first body in a case. Who was he? That evening, back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret sat behind his desk, a cup of cold coffee at his elbow. The reports were laid out neatly before him, statements from the cafe owner, the maid, and the constables. Nothing connected, nothing pointed in any clear direction. The dead man remained nameless, the woman faceless, the motive invisible. He leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the hum of the building around him. Outside, the fog thickened again over the river. Somewhere in the distance, a barge whistle sounded, low and mournful. Maigret opened the window, letting the chill air in. He could almost imagine the woman's perfume still lingering there, faint but unmistakable. A reminder that behind every crime there was always a trace of the human, something fragile and irrational that no report could capture. He exhaled a long breath, smoke curling upward. "The killer who left the truth behind," he muttered softly, repeating the phrase that had formed unbidden in his mind since he first saw the scene. It wasn't the kind of case that would make headlines, but it was the kind that clung to a man long after it was solved, if it ever truly was. The telephone rang once, sharp and sudden. Maigret reached for it. "Yes." A voice crackled over the line. "Inspector, there's been another one. Same pattern, different district." Maigray's hand tightened on the receiver. "Where?" "Rue Le Pic, a hotel room." For a moment, Maigret said nothing. Then he stubbed out his pipe, grabbed his coat, and headed for the door. The night was waiting, and the truth, whatever it was, had just become much more complicated. The street was darker in Rue Le Pic, its narrow curve climbing up toward Montmartre like a vein through the old heart of Paris. When Maigret arrived, the rain had stopped, leaving behind the glistening reflections of lanterns on wet stone and the faint murmur of the city winding down. A small crowd had gathered outside the modest hotel where the second body had been found. The curious, the anxious, the kind who always seem to appear when something terrible has happened, their faces half lit by the glow of curiosity. Inside, the smell of disinfectant fought with that of damp plaster and old smoke. The hotel clerk, a man with ink-stained fingers and an over-polished manner, wrung his hands nervously as Maigret entered. "It's the same, Inspector," he said, his voice trembling. "Locked room, no sign of a struggle, and—" He hesitated, as if the words themselves were too strange to believe. And the clock stopped again. 10:47. Maigret said nothing at first. He removed his hat, shook off the rain, and began climbing the narrow staircase. He could already feel the faint pressure in his chest, the quiet dread that came whenever the pieces of a puzzle began to resemble a pattern he did not yet understand. The room was on the second floor. The air was heavy, stale, almost untouched, since the police had sealed it earlier that evening. A lamp burned low on the table. The bed was neatly made, except for the body lying across it. This one was younger than the first, perhaps 35, clean-shaven, wearing a dark wool suit and polished shoes. The same arrangement, hands folded, eyes half open as if death had come mid-thought. The same 2 glasses on the table, one untouched, one faintly smudged with lipstick. And there it was again, that faint, unmistakable perfume, lilac, lingering just above the other smells, haunting the air. Janvier joined him moments later, closing the door behind him. "It's as if someone is mocking us," he said quietly. Maigret didn't answer. He stood near the table, examining the glasses. This time there was a trace of something more, a tiny crystal grain at the bottom of one. He dipped a finger, tasted it, then grimaced. "Bitter," he murmured. "Like morphine or quinine." Janvier pulled out his notebook. "You think it's the same killer?" "I think it's the same story," Maigret said. "And stories, when they repeat, always hide something deliberate." He moved to the window. Outside, the fog from the Seine had crept up even here, softening the lamplight into halos. Somewhere below, a cab clattered past, its horse's breath visible in the chill. The world went on, blind to what was happening in these small, silent rooms. The clerk had mentioned that the man checked in under a false name. Monsieur Legrand, paying in cash for 3 nights. No luggage, no visitors, except perhaps one. The chambermaid had claimed to see a woman in a grey coat entering the hotel the night before, around 10, her face hidden beneath a veil. She had not seen her leave. Maigret turned back to Janvier. "We need to find her, and we need to know who these men really were. 2 deaths, same hour, same perfume, that's not coincidence." By dawn, the report from the coroner confirmed it. Morphine poisoning, likely ingested. The doses were precise, fatal, but measured. Whoever had prepared them knew exactly what they were doing. It was not an act of passion or anger, it was clinical. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret spread the two case files across his desk. The photographs, two men, similar in age, build, and bearing. Both dressed well, both without pasts, their wallets empty, their watches missing, their identities erased, as cleanly as if someone had brushed them from existence. Lucas entered, carrying a stack of papers. "We ran their prints, Chief. No records. Nothing in the criminal files, no matches in the military archives." "Then they were ghosts," Maigret said, "or someone made them into ghosts." The morning dragged into afternoon, the grey sky over the river never lifting. Maigret sat with his pipe, smoke curling in the lamplight, staring at the wall where the photographs hung side by side. There was something he was missing. Not in what was there, but in what wasn't. Both rooms were too clean. Both deaths too staged. It was as though someone wanted him to see only what they allowed. By late evening, a visitor arrived, a journalist from Le Matin, breathless and eager. "Inspector Maigret, I heard about the two deaths. Some are saying it's a suicide pact, others a secret society. Is it true?" Maigret regarded him coolly. "It's true that two men are dead," he said, his voice low and measured. "And that's all anyone should say for now." The journalist hesitated, then leaned closer. "There's talk of a woman. They say she was seen in both places. Some call her La Veuve Blanche, the White Widow. Ever heard of her?" The name lingered in the air long after the man had gone. La Veuve Blanche. It sounded like a legend, a ghost whispered through the cafes of Montmartre. Maigret had heard the name once before, years ago, a rumour among vice inspectors about a woman who appeared in gambling circles, charming wealthy men who vanished soon after. But there had never been proof, only smoke and speculation. He tapped his pipe against the ashtray. Could it be her? Or was the name just another shadow to lead him astray? That night, Maigret couldn't sleep. He sat by the window of his flat on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the rain starting again, steady and persistent. Madame Maigret had gone to bed hours ago, leaving him alone with the glow of the lamp and the rhythm of the falling water. He watched it trace slow patterns down the glass and thought of the two clocks, both stopped at the same minute, as if time itself had been made complicit. In his mind, he could see her. Not clearly, just the outline of a woman in grey, her hands delicate, her face half hidden. She would smile faintly as she poured the wine, her perfume soft and familiar. The man would trust her. He might even love her. And then, when the hour came, she would watch the life fade from his eyes, stop the clock, and leave without a sound. The next morning, Lucas came in with news. "We've identified the first victim. His name's Etienne Roussel, former clerk at a shipping company in Le Havre. Left his job 3 months ago, no forwarding address. And the second? Still working on it. But there's something else. Both men received telegrams the day before their deaths. From Liège." "Liège?" Maigret repeated. He rose slowly, the word pulling at something deep in his memory. "That's Belgium, a long way from Paris." "Same handwriting, same phrasing," Lucas continued. "Come to Paris at once. Urgent matter. Signed, A." A pause hung between them, thick as the smoke from Maigret's pipe. The pattern was no longer coincidence. It was choreography. Someone had lured these men here. To die. Maigret leaned over the case files once more, the ink smudging slightly under his fingertips. The truth, he thought, was not hidden by the fog, but woven through it, a thread so fine one might miss it, unless they looked at the spaces between things, not the things themselves. He turned toward Lucas. "We leave for Liège tomorrow." The younger man hesitated. You think we'll find her there? Maigret exhaled slowly. I think, he said, we'll find where the truth began. Outside, the bells of Notre Dame tolled through the mist, slow and resonant, carrying across the city like the heartbeat of something ancient. The case had moved beyond Paris now, beyond the borders of reason. In the gathering dusk, Maigret knew that whatever lay ahead, it would not end with another body. It would end with understanding. And that was sometimes the cruelest discovery of all. The train from Paris to Liège cut through the countryside beneath a grey, patient sky. Maigret sat by the window, his heavy overcoat folded neatly beside him, the rhythmic clatter of wheels merging with the low hum of thought. Lucas dozed opposite him, his hat tilted over his eyes, a folded newspaper slipping from his fingers. Outside, the field stretched wide and empty, dotted with leafless trees and the occasional farmhouse. It was late autumn, the season when the world seemed to hold its breath before winter. Maigret's pipe had long gone cold, but he kept it in his mouth out of habit. He was not a man to rely on instinct alone, and yet, on this journey, instinct was all he had. 2 dead men, both summoned by a letter from Liège, both meeting their end in the same manner at the same hour. It was not the work of chance, nor of madness. It was the work of memory. Someone was tying off loose ends from a past that refused to stay buried. They arrived by mid-afternoon. Liège greeted them with a dull sky and the distant chime of church bells. The streets glistened from an earlier rain, and the Meuse River wound lazily through the city, its waters reflecting the dull light of the hour. Maigret had not been here in years, but the smell was the same. Coal smoke and damp stone, the quiet melancholy of an industrial town that carried its secrets with pride. Their first stop was the local police commissariat. The Belgian inspector in charge, a thin man with restless eyes named Dumont, greeted them with polite reserve. "We've heard of your reputation, Inspector Maigret," he said, leading them into a small office that smelled faintly of tobacco and old ink. 2 dead Frenchmen, you say? Both called to Paris from here? Curious indeed. Maigret nodded. Both received telegrams from Liège signed with the initial A. We believe whoever sent them is connected to someone, or something, in this city. Dumont leafed through a stack of papers. I've taken the liberty of checking our telegraph records. There were indeed 2 messages sent to Paris on consecutive days, both from the same post office near the Rue Saint-Gilles, paid in cash. No sender's name. Do you have anyone who remembers the person who sent them? Dumont gave a tight smile. The clerk describes a woman, mid-30s perhaps, well-dressed, spoke little, but with an accent, Belgian, possibly Walloon, left quickly. Maigret leaned back in his chair, eyes half narrowed. Did she smell of lilac? Dumont blinked. Lilac? I can't say, but if you ask me, Inspector, this sounds more like a lover's revenge than a criminal plot. Maigret said nothing. Lovers rarely took such care to disguise their work. He thanked the man and left with Lucas into the grey drizzle of the street. They found the post office easily, a squat stone building on a quiet corner, its windows fogged from within. The clerk on duty was young, nervous, and eager to please. He remembered the woman immediately. Elegant, he said. Wore gloves, a light veil, paid with francs, not Belgian notes. Her voice, soft, a bit foreign. She asked the time as she left. The time? Maigret asked. 10:47, monsieur. The number struck him like a bell. 10:47, the hour the clocks had been stopped in both Parisian rooms. It was no longer a coincidence. It was a ritual. As they left, the drizzle thickened into rain. They took shelter beneath a café awning. Maigret ordered coffee, black and strong. The warmth seeped slowly into his fingers as he stared through the misted glass at the passers-by. Somewhere among them, the woman in grey had walked this same street, perhaps pausing in front of the same cafe, unseen, unnoticed. "Do you think she's still here?" Lucas asked quietly. Maigret stirred his coffee. "If she's clever, and I believe she is, she's already gone. But her past isn't." He pulled from his pocket the file on Etienne Roussel, former shipping clerk from Le Havre. A respectable man, no criminal record, no debts. But in the corner of one of the papers an address had been scrawled, Rue Lambert, Liège, half faded, as though erased. They found the house that evening. A narrow, crumbling building near the river, its shutters half broken, and its steps slick with moss. An old woman answered the door, her eyes clouded but sharp. "Yes, I remember him," she said when Maigret showed her Roussel's photograph. "He lived upstairs for a year, maybe two, kept to himself, always polite. Then one day he left and without a word." "Was he alone?" The woman hesitated. "No, not always. There was a lady who came often. Beautiful, but sad-looking, smelled like spring flowers. Lilac, I think. She used to sit at the window, smoking those thin cigarettes. I could see her from the street." Maigret nodded slowly. "Do you remember her name?" "Annette," the woman said after a pause. She called herself Annette. Back at their hotel, Maigret sat in silence for a long while. The rain beat softly against the panes. Lucas had fallen asleep in the armchair, still half-dressed, his notes scattered across the table. Maigret stared at the single word written in his notebook. Annette. The name meant nothing to him, and yet it carried weight. 2 men dead, a woman named Annette, telegrams from Liège, and the clock that always stopped at 10:47. He reached for his pipe, but it had gone out again. He thought of something the old woman had said. Beautiful, but sad-looking. There was a story in that sadness, perhaps the reason for it all. Love gone wrong, betrayal, a debt unpaid. And yet Maigret knew better than to believe in the simplicity of emotion. People killed for love, yes, but also for memory, for guilt, for the unbearable burden of truth. Outside, the rain softened into mist. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, 10 slow, deliberate chimes. Maigret rose, pulled the curtain aside, and watched the empty street below. A solitary figure crossed under a street lamp, moving swiftly through the fog. The coat was grey, the stride purposeful. Then, just as quickly, she vanished into the darkness. He stood for a long time, unmoving. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "She's not finished yet." The next morning brought a telegram addressed to Maigret at the hotel. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, and unfamiliar. Only 5 words were written on the page. "You are looking in the wrong place. No signature, no sender, only the faintest trace of lilac perfume on the paper." Maigret folded it carefully, slipped it into his pocket, and reached for his coat. The game had changed. What had begun as a pursuit of a murderer was becoming something else, a pursuit of understanding, of connection, of whatever fragile thread bound the living to the dead. He turned to Lucas, who was stirring awake. "Pack your things," he said. "We're going back to Paris." "Already?" "Yes," Maigret said, "because whoever she is, Annette doesn't want us in Liège, which means the truth is waiting for us somewhere else." As the train pulled away from the station, Maigret looked out across the fading city. He thought again of the woman's perfume, of the moment she must have stood behind those men as they drank their final glass of wine. The hour would strike 10:47 again soon. And he knew before this was over, that time would stop once more. The fog had rolled back into Paris by the time Maigret returned, thick and unrelenting, clinging to the city like a living thing. The train had reached the Gare du Nord just after dusk, its whistle echoing off the iron rafters before vanishing into the haze. As Maigret stepped onto the platform, he felt the familiar weight of the city settle over him again. The scent of coal, the slow rhythm of footsteps on wet stone, the subdued hum of a metropolis that never truly slept. Lucas followed behind, carrying their modest luggage, his face drawn from lack of rest. The telegram still sat folded in Maigret's pocket, the faint scent of lilac lingering as if mocking him. "You are looking in the wrong place." It was not just a taunt, it was a message meant to redirect him, perhaps to protect something or someone. Whoever she was, she knew how to play the game. They went straight to the Quai des Orfèvres. The building was quiet at that hour, the corridors echoing with the distant sounds of typewriters and muted voices. Maigret's office lamp still burned, casting a pool of amber light over the scattered files on his desk. Janvier was waiting there, pipe in hand, reading through a stack of reports. "Welcome back, Chief," he said, rising as they entered. "I've been keeping things warm for you. Something's turned up while you were gone." Maigret hung his coat carefully, then moved toward the desk. "Tell me." Janvier opened a folder. "We identified the second victim. Name's André Marchand. Former bookkeeper for a trading firm. Disappeared from his post about 6 months ago, but no address left behind. His landlady thought he'd gone abroad, but look at this." He handed over a letter, creased and yellowed with handling. The stationery bore the letterhead of Roussel and Marchand, shipping agents, Le Havre. Maigret's eyebrows rose slightly. "Business partners?" "Until 2 years ago," Janvier replied. "The firm folded after a scandal. Missing funds, forged invoices, a quiet settlement, no charges filed. Both men left Le Havre around the same time." Maigret read the letter in silence. It was written in a confident hand, dated nearly 2 years prior. The tone was strained, almost pleading. "We cannot hide this forever. If it comes to light, we'll both pay for it. A." He folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "A," he said softly. "The same initial as on the telegrams." Lucas frowned. "You think she's the same person? Annette?" Maigret didn't answer immediately. He rose, walked to the window, and looked out at the lamps shimmering across the river. "A woman named Annette, who sends telegrams from Liège to summon 2 men tied by a secret past. Both die at the same hour, in the same way. She knows what binds them and what must be erased." He turned back, his gaze steady. "It's not love driving her, it's restitution." They worked late into the night, tracing the collapsed firm's history. The records revealed quiet irregularities, small but consistent. Freight manifests altered by hand, payments recorded twice, shipments redirected. It was an old pattern familiar to Maigret, men of modest ambition who found themselves too deep in temptation to pull back. But what interested him most was a name that kept appearing in the company's correspondence: Annette Delvaux. She had worked as a secretary in the Le Havre office before it shut down. Her file listed her as unmarried, Belgian by birth, address unknown. The last entry was dated almost exactly 2 years before Roussel's disappearance. Maigret tapped his pipe against the edge of the ashtray. "There's our missing link," he said quietly. "She wasn't just a witness. She was part of it." Janvier frowned. "But why kill them now after 2 years?" "Because time doesn't erase guilt," Maigret said. "It only makes it quieter, until someone decides to listen again." He leaned back in his chair. His thoughts drifted to the telegram she had sent him. "You are looking in the wrong place." It was not a denial. It was almost a plea. Perhaps she did not want to be found, or perhaps she wanted him to find something else. Something the men had done that still needed uncovering. By dawn, the first hints of light were filtering through the fog. Maigret had sent Lucas to the archives, Janvier to the telegraph bureau. He sat alone, watching the smoke curl above his desk lamp. On the corner of the table lay the photograph of Roussel and Marchand, side by side. Two men who had shared a secret and met the same end, one after the other, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. At 8 o'clock, Lucas returned, his coat dusted with rain. "We found something, Chief, a third name." He handed over a telegram receipt. It was dated the morning after Marchand's death, addressed to Pierre Leroux, sent from a kiosk near the Gare Saint-Lazare. The handwriting matched that of the previous messages, and again it was signed simply A. "Leroux," Maigret repeated. "Do we know where he is?" "Hôtel des Ardennes, Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. Checked in 2 days ago." Maigret's pipe went out between his fingers. He rose immediately, pulling on his overcoat. "Get Janvier, we're going." The Hôtel des Ardennes was the sort of place where people came to disappear, a maze of narrow corridors, threadbare carpets, and doors that had seen too many stories unfold behind them. The desk clerk, a thin man with ink on his cuffs, blinked when Maigret showed his badge. "Monsieur Leroux?" "Yes, he's here, room 23, though I haven't seen him since breakfast." Maigret's hand went instinctively to his watch. It was 10:30. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, the floorboards groaning beneath his boots. The corridor was dim, the gas lamps flickering. He could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere ahead, a sound that now seemed to fill every silence with dread. He stopped before room 23. The door was locked. He knocked once. No answer. Again, harder. Still nothing. Janvier stepped forward with a nod, and together they forced it open. The smell hit them first, not of death, but of perfume. Lilac, heavy and unmistakable. The curtains were drawn, the air still. A lamp burned low beside the bed, and on the table 2 glasses. One half full, one untouched. Pierre Leroux lay across the bed, fully clothed, his hands folded neatly over his chest. The clock beside him had stopped. Maigret didn't need to look to know the time. 10:47. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence in the room was almost reverent, as though the act itself had been performed with ritual precision. Then Maigret moved forward, his expression unreadable, and set the glass down carefully on the table. "She's finished her work," he said quietly. 3 men, 3 debts paid. But she's not hiding from us anymore. She's waiting. He turned toward the door. "Seal the room. No one leaves until I say so." Outside, the bells of a nearby church struck the hour. 11. The city went on breathing its ordinary breath, unaware that time, for one woman at least, had been standing still for far too long. Maigret looked up through the fog toward the river. Somewhere out there, Annette Delvaux was alive, and for the first time she wanted him to find her. By morning, Paris had shrugged off its fog and replaced it with a low, hard rain that turned the cobblestones of the Quai des Orfèvres into black glass. Maigret stood by the window of his office, staring out at the river below, the light from the water rippling against the ceiling. The city felt different now, not just the ordinary hum of its secrets, but something more deliberate, as if the streets themselves were complicit in the crimes being uncovered. Behind him, the ticking of the wall clock filled the silence with an oddly human patience. Lucas and Janvier entered almost together, their coats dripping, their hats beaded with rain. "Nothing new on Annette Delvaux," Lucas said, shaking off his umbrella. "She vanished completely after the company folded. No bank records, no residence permits, no passport renewal." "She didn't vanish," Maigret said quietly. "She erased herself." He turned from the window and began pacing the room. 3 men connected by a single company, 1 woman, and a scandal buried under silence. She's not killing out of anger. It's order, method. She's tying off what was left undone. Janvier dropped a folder on the desk. "We traced the firm's final accounts. There's a missing sum by 40,000 francs, never recovered. Roussel and Marchand each withdrew 10,000 just before the business closed. The rest unaccounted for." "And Leroux?" Maigret asked. "His share too," Janvier said. "He worked for the same firm, but resigned earlier. No proof, but he likely had a hand in it. It's all too clean." Maigret filled his pipe, tamping the tobacco carefully. "So 3 men steal 40,000 francs, each takes his portion, and vanish. 2 years later, they die? Not by chance, but by appointment." Lucas frowned. "Then what about Annette? What was she? An accomplice?" Maigret struck a match and shook it out almost at once. "Maybe more, maybe less. But if she wrote those telegrams, she's carrying something none of them could. Guilt." For a moment, no one spoke. The rain had softened into a steady murmur. Somewhere down the corridor, a phone rang, distant and ignored. Maigret turned the envelope over in his hands, the one containing her last telegram to him. The scent had faded, but it still lingered faintly. Lilac and smoke. By midday, he decided to visit someone who might remember her, someone who remembered everything. The man's name was Armand Lefebvre, a former police accountant now retired to a cluttered apartment above a bakery on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré. He had once audited half the import firms along the northern coast and had an elephant's memory for names. When Maigret arrived, Lefebvre was seated by the fire, surrounded by old ledgers, his spectacles balanced on the end of his nose. "Maigret, I thought you'd forgotten me," he said with a laugh, pouring 2 glasses of brandy. "I never forget debts," Maigret replied, taking the offered seat. "I'm looking into a case at the old Roussel and Marchand firm. Do you recall it?" Lefebvre's face tightened. "Ah, yes. Quiet little scandal, that one. On the surface, it was just bad accounting. But I remember whispers. A missing shipment, papers destroyed in a fire. And there was a girl, wasn't there? Worked in the office. Pretty thing, Annette something." Delvaux. "Yes, that's it. Smart, too. Too smart for her own good. The story I heard, she uncovered the fraud before anyone else did. Tried to warn Roussel, but he was already part of it. The men promised her a share if she kept quiet. Then when the firm collapsed, she disappeared. Some said she ran away to Belgium. Others said she married. Or perhaps neither," Maigret murmured. Lefebvre smiled sadly. "You always did see further than the rest of us." When Maigret left, the air outside had grown heavier, thick with the scent of rain-soaked bread and coal smoke. He walked slowly back toward the river, the words echoing in his mind. She uncovered the fraud before anyone else did. That was the key. Annette Delvaux had not been part of the theft. She had been its conscience. And perhaps, when no one else would bear the truth, she decided to punish those who would not confess. Back at the office, Lucas had already begun mapping connections. Red pins marked each man's residence, each death, each telegram. Together they formed a crooked triangle that seemed to point toward the same place, Le Havre. "She's circling the past," Maigret said, staring at the map. "Everything begins and ends there." He leaned forward, tracing the line between Paris and the coast with his finger. She's finished with the men, but not with herself. If guilt drove her to kill, what's left now is atonement. Janvier looked up. Then she'll go back to where it started. Exactly. That night, Maigret sent telegrams to the Le Havre prefecture, the port authority, and the train station. He gave a name and a description. Annette Delvaux, approximately 35, grey coat, lilac perfume. The reply came near midnight while he sat alone in his office, the lamp burning low. Female passenger matching description arrived by afternoon train. No luggage. Purchased ticket for Honfleur. Departed 1815. Honfleur, a small coastal town, quiet, almost forgotten, where the sea met the mouth of the Seine. Maigret folded the message carefully, rose, and reached for his hat. He would leave before dawn. He found Lucas asleep on the bench outside the office and woke him with a hand on the shoulder. "She's gone to Honfleur," he said. "Get the car ready. We're going after her." The rain had stopped by the time they left Paris, though the clouds hung low and bruised. The road unwound ahead of them through empty fields and sleeping villages, the headlights carving pale paths through the mist. Neither man spoke much. The case had grown beyond reason, beyond law. It was no longer about evidence or motive, but about the quiet spaces between. As the first light began to break over the estuary, they saw the rooftops of Honfleur rising from the fog, a town of narrow streets and shuttered houses, where the tide whispered against the docks and gulls circled like pale ghosts. Maigret's eyes narrowed as they passed a small inn by the harbour. A grey-coated figure stood at the window of an upstairs room, motionless, watching the sea. For a moment, it seemed she'd turned her head, as if she'd known he would come. He stopped the car. "Wait here," he told Lucas. Then he stepped out, his coat heavy with salt air, the distant sound of waves mingling with the cry of gulls. He climbed the steps slowly, each one echoing the quiet certainty of what he would find above, the last piece of the story, waiting to end itself. He reached the landing, the door half open, the faint scent of lilac floating through. "Madame Delvaux," he said softly. A voice, calm and low, answered from within. "You're late, Inspector. I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." The room was small and bare, the kind of seaside lodging rented by those who sought neither comfort nor company. Pale morning light filtered through the thin curtains, silvering the air. Annette Delvaux stood by the window, her back to him, her grey coat still on, as though she had been standing there all night. Maigret paused in the doorway, the faint smell of lilac drifting between them, and for a moment he felt the strange intimacy of the scene. Two people who had followed the same trail, though for different reasons, arriving at its end together. "I thought you'd be taller," she said, without turning. Maigret smiled faintly. "I've often heard that." He closed the door behind him, removing his hat. "You've led me a long way, Madame Delvaux. Paris to Liège, then here." She turned slowly, her face calm, almost serene. The years had softened her beauty, but not erased it. Her eyes still carried that clear, unguarded sadness that Maigret had imagined on the train. "You weren't supposed to find me," she said. "But I knew you would." Maigret looked around the room. A small table by the bed, a single suitcase, and beside it a bottle of wine with 2 glasses, one full, one empty. His eyes lingered on the glasses, then on the clock resting on the nightstand. It ticked steadily, still alive. 10:30. "You didn't stop it this time," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "There's no one left to stop it for." He moved closer, his voice low and steady. "You killed them, didn't you? Roussel, Marchand, and Leroux. You brought them to Paris, one by one." She met his gaze without flinching. I didn't kill them. They killed themselves. I only gave them the choice. He said nothing, waiting. She crossed the room, her steps slow, deliberate, the faint rustle of fabric the only sound. They thought I wouldn't know, she said. Back then I was just a secretary. I typed their invoices, filed their reports, made the tea. But I saw everything, the false manifests, the forged shipments. I told Roussel I would go to the police unless they returned what they took. He laughed. He said I was in it now, that if the truth came out I'd be ruined too. Her voice remained calm, almost detached, as though reciting a story that no longer belonged to her. When the firm collapsed, they disappeared with the money. I was left to answer the questions. I fled to Liège because there was nothing left for me in France. For a while I tried to forget. I told myself they'd suffer in their own way. But every year I read their names in the trade journals, new positions, new fortunes. They'd built new lives on the money they stole. Maigret studied her face. And so you decided to balance the scales. Her lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. No, I decided to tell them the truth. I wrote to each of them, told them I knew what they'd done, told them they could meet me in Paris, make amends, or live the rest of their lives waiting for the knock at the door. And they came, Maigret said. Yes, one by one. They came because guilt doesn't fade. It waits. I let them see me, let them understand that I hadn't forgotten. Then I offered them a glass of wine. With morphine. She nodded. They knew what was in it. I didn't lie to them. They drank because they couldn't live with the truth. I never forced their hands. Maigret's gaze drifted toward the ticking clock again. You stopped it each time. To mark the moment, she said softly. The moment they stopped running. For a long time, neither spoke. The sea outside breathed against the shore, the slow pulse of the tide filling the silence. Finally, Maigret said, "And now?" Annette turned back to the window. Now it's over. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small envelope, setting it on the table. The money! What's left of it? I kept my share all these years untouched. I was saving it for the end. Maigret looked at it, but didn't move. You think giving it back will make a difference? No, she said, but perhaps it will make it end. He stepped closer. You could still live. There's no proof you poisoned them. You could start again. She smiled faintly, a distant, almost wistful smile. Start again? In what world, Inspector? I've lived in silence for too long. This... She gestured toward the grey light outside. Is the last place I wanted to see? He heard the faintest tremor in her voice then, a crack in the composure she had held so tightly. She turned toward him once more, her eyes glistening, and he saw it, the exhaustion, the fragile pride, the quiet despair. I didn't hate them, she said. Not at first. But when I saw how easily they forgot me, I realized something. The worst crime isn't theft or even murder. It's indifference. They could have saved me with a single word of truth, but they chose silence. So I gave it back to them. Her hands trembled as she reached for the second glass on the table, the one still half full. Maigret's eyes followed the movement. Don't, he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the glass down carefully, almost tenderly, beside the other. You misunderstand, Inspector. It's not fear that brings people to confession. It's memory. I've confessed already to myself. Maigret moved closer, his voice low. Annette, listen to me. You've done enough. Let me take you back to Paris. We'll find a way. She shook her head. There's no Paris left for me. And before he could stop her, she lifted a small vial from her pocket, no larger than a perfume bottle. The glass caught the light as she turned it in her fingers. "You see," she said softly. "It's all been decided." "Annette—" But she was already drinking, the movement graceful, almost ceremonial. The liquid disappeared in a single swallow. She set the vial on the table beside the clock. "I wanted someone to know," she whispered. "Someone who would understand that I wasn't cruel. Just tired." Her eyes closed then, her body relaxing as though surrendering to sleep. Maigret caught her as she fell, lowering her gently to the floor. Her pulse flickered once beneath his fingers, then faded. Outside, the tide shifted again, the distant cry of gulls rising over the harbour. Maigret remained kneeling beside her for a long time, his expression unreadable. The room smelled of lilac and salt, and the faintest trace of wine. When Lucas entered minutes later, breathless, Maigret didn't look up. "She's gone," he said simply. On the table, the clock still ticked. He reached out and stopped it at 10:47. They brought her body back to Paris under a low sky, the kind that swallowed sound and light alike. The sea mist clung to Maigret's coat as the car wound its way through the narrow streets of Honfleur toward the station. Annette Delvaux lay in the back, wrapped in a simple shroud, as unassuming in death as she had been in life. The local doctor had written a single line on the death certificate: self-administered morphine, quantity lethal, time uncertain. The prefect's clerk suggested she be buried quietly, without inquiry or press attention, but Maigret refused. "No," he said, "she deserves a name in the record, not another silence." On the train back, he sat facing the window, pipe unlit, the countryside sliding past like a film of half-remembered places. Lucas said nothing. He had learned long ago that when Maigret's thoughts were turned inward, silence was the only company worth keeping. The city greeted them with rain again. Steady, rhythmic, almost cleansing. By the time they reached the Quai des Orfèvres, it was past midnight. Janvier was waiting, the smell of coffee and tobacco heavy in the room. "Everything's in order, Chief. The press doesn't know a thing." Maigret nodded absently. He sank into his chair, his heavy frame seeming to settle into the wood itself. "Keep it that way." He reached into his coat and withdrew the small envelope Annette had left. The one, she said, contained what remained of the stolen money. Inside was a folded bank certificate, dated 2 years prior, for precisely 40,000 francs deposited under a false name at a small bank in Brussels. Attached was a note in her careful, steady hand, for restitution to whoever still believes in it. Maigret held it for a long moment before setting it down beside the case files. "She never spent a sou," he said quietly. "She lived all those years with ghosts, and not once did she touch what damned them all." Janvier hesitated. "Do you believe her?" "I do," Maigret said, "because guilt that deep doesn't lie." He looked up at the ceiling, the pipes humming faintly in the walls. Somewhere outside, a tugboat horn echoed along the river, and he thought again of her last words. "It's not fear that brings people to confession. It's memory." For days afterward, he found himself drifting through Paris as though searching for her ghost. He walked along the Seine at dusk, where the street lamps shimmered on the water like small suns drowning in the current. He passed the cafes where she might have sat unnoticed, the bookshops and tobacco stalls, the narrow alleys where lovers quarrelled under the drizzle. Everywhere, life carried on, indifferent and alive. The report came back from Brussels a week later. The account had indeed been opened under the name Madame D.L., and the funds, still untouched, were now being transferred to the state under official process. It was tidy, bureaucratic, lifeless, the kind of closure Maigret disliked. He stared at the letter for a long while before folding it away. Then he lit his pipe and let the smoke drift upward, as if the story might rewrite itself in the air. That evening, Madame Maigret found him sitting by the window of their flat on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, his pipe gone cold. "You haven't eaten?" she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. He nodded without looking up. "Do you ever think," he murmured, "that some people are born only to carry other people's mistakes?" She frowned softly. "You can't carry them all, Jewel." He smiled tiredly. "No, but sometimes I meet someone who tries." Later that night, when the city had quieted and even the Seine seemed to breathe slower, he found himself unable to sleep. The case was finished. Reports filed, papers signed, evidence sealed. But something in him resisted the word finished. There was no sense of victory, no satisfaction. Only the steady rhythm of rain and the hollow truth that justice, in this world, was often too small for the crimes of the heart. At dawn, he walked to the Pont Neuf. The streets were empty, the river swollen and grey beneath him. He leaned against the parapet, hands in his pockets, watching the current carry bits of debris downstream, a cork, a torn scrap of paper, a dead leaf spinning slowly before vanishing beneath the arch. He imagined, just for a moment, Annette standing where he stood, her coat pulled tight, her eyes fixed on the same restless water. He wondered what she'd seen there. Punishment, redemption, or simply peace. He turned to leave when something caught his eye. A folded paper, damp and half stuck against the stone. He bent to pick it up. The ink was blurred, but a few words remained legible. "Forgive us. We were weak." No signature, no clue of origin, just those words, scrawled in a hand that trembled. It could have been any of them, Roussel, Marchand, Leroux, or none at all. But to Maigret it was enough. He tucked the paper into his coat pocket and walked slowly back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, the morning light filtering through the fog. The case would be archived under homicides doubtful. No prosecution. The money would be absorbed by the state, the names forgotten, and life would continue its indifferent flow. Yet somewhere in the files, in neat black ink, there would remain a single line written by Maigret himself. The truth was known, but it cost more than it was worth. And in that quiet phrasing, the city would keep another of its countless secrets, sealed beneath the surface, where only the eyes of the Seine would ever truly see it. Paris that winter wore her melancholy like a veil. The rain did not fall so much as drift, blurring the city's edges, dimming its noise to the slow pulse of the river. For most, it was only weather. For Maigret, it was memory, the kind that clings to the skin. He had closed the Delvaux file weeks ago, yet it remained on his desk, the top folder, in a growing stack of unfinished truths. The routine of days resumed. Interrogations, petty thefts, quarrels gone too far. But something in him had shifted. He could not shake the feeling that he had seen not merely the end of a crime, but the anatomy of one. Guilt born, guilt lived, guilt absolved through death. In quieter moments, he found himself glancing toward the window, half expecting to see her walking past the Seine again, coat drawn close, face turned away. It was late one evening, near closing, when a uniformed constable entered with a note. "Came from the bridge patrol, sir," he said, placing it on Maigret's desk. Maigret unfolded it, reading by the soft lamp glow. Body found under Pont de la Tournelle. Female, grey coat. The words struck him like a chill. When? An hour ago, pulled from the water by the river watch. He rose slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath him. Janvier looked up from the corner. "Chief?" Maigray's voice was low, almost distant. "Come with me." The bridge loomed pale through the fog, the air thick with the smell of wet stone and riverweed. The body lay on a stretcher beside the embankment, covered by a blanket. Two gendarmes stood nearby, their breath visible in the cold. "She's not fresh, sir," one said quietly. "Been in the water at least a week, maybe more. No papers. Could be anyone." Maigret knelt, lifting the corner of the blanket. The face beneath was unrecognizable. The water had taken its toll. But the hair was dark, and the fabric of the coat unmistakably grey. His gaze lingered on the hand, delicate and pale, where the faint outline of a ring still marked the skin. He let the blanket fall back. "Take her to the morgue," he said softly. "I'll come in the morning." They stood in silence as the stretcher was carried away. The river lapped gently against the stone embankment, as if whispering secrets it would never share. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier broke the silence. "You don't think it's her? It can't be." Maigret rubbed his temple. "No, it can't. But the city likes to repeat itself, even its ghosts." He poured himself a small measure of brandy and stared at the steam rising from the dye. "Do you remember what she said, Janvier? About indifference being the worst crime?" Janvier nodded slowly. "Well," Maigret said, "it seems Paris has found a way to prove her right." The following morning confirmed what he already knew. The body was not Annette Delvaux. Too young, too tall, a woman from the provinces who'd likely slipped or been pushed into the river after dark. But the resemblance had stirred something in him. A recognition that the city never stops creating stories, each echoing the last. He walked alone along the quay, his coat collar turned up against the wind. Barges drifted under the bridges, their engines humming softly, the workers' voices lost to the current. The faint scent of lilac came suddenly, impossibly, carried on the damp air. Fleeting, gone before he could turn to find its source. He smiled to himself, a weary smile touched by disbelief. "So," he murmured, "you're still here?" He paused by the parapet, watching the slow, indifferent river slide beneath him. Somewhere far downstream it would carry silt, secrets, and the remains of 1,000 forgotten stories into the sea. A sound behind him. Footsteps. He turned to see Madame Maigret approaching, her umbrella struggling against the wind. "You didn't come home for breakfast," she said gently. "I thought you might be here." He nodded, not surprised. She joined him at the railing, following his gaze toward the water. "Is it over now?" she asked. Maigret exhaled. "For her, yes. For the rest of us, it never is." They stood together in silence, the city waking slowly around them. Somewhere nearby, a baker rolled up his shutters, a carriage rattled past on the cobblestones. The ordinary rhythm of Paris resumed, swallowing another tragedy whole. "Do you think she found peace?" Madame Maigret asked quietly. Maigret took a long breath. "Peace," he said, "isn't found, it's accepted. And sometimes that's the same thing." They began to walk back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, the faint hum of the city swelling behind them. The river flowed beside them like a mirror, endless, reflective, always in motion. And though Maigret never spoke of her again, each spring, when the lilacs began to bloom and their scent drifted through the narrow streets of the 5th arrondissement, he would pause, close his eyes and remember. He remembered the woman by the window in Honfleur, her calm eyes, her quiet voice, the clock she refused to stop. He remembered the men who died, not of murder, but of conscience. And he remembered that sometimes the truth one finds beneath the bridges of Paris is not the kind that sets you free, but the kind that teaches you how to live with what cannot be changed. The rain began again, gentle and persistent. Maigret lifted his collar, his pipe smoke mingling with the mist. The day stretched ahead, another case waiting, another life unraveling. He would go on as the city went on, silent, watchful, endlessly human. And somewhere in that ceaseless motion, beneath the surface of every mystery, the river whispered the same eternal refrain, that even the darkest truths once uncovered simply flow back into the heart of Paris, to be born again. The case was closed, yet it clung to Maigret's days like the residue of pipe smoke that never quite left his coat. The official report had been filed under a neutral heading: mortalities connected to financial fraud, Liège-Paris-Ligne, a phrasing that meant nothing and offended no one. In the records, Annette Delvaux existed only as a note in the margins, her name marked with an asterisk beside the words, "No trial warranted." It was the bureaucracy's way of absolving itself from the unease of conscience. But for Maigret, cases didn't end with ink or signatures. They lingered, taking root somewhere between memory and instinct. Weeks passed, yet he felt her presence everywhere, on quiet evenings when the fog returned to the river, in the smell of a certain cafe where the wallpaper had turned the colour of old tobacco, in the dull gleam of a stopped clock on a nightstand. It wasn't guilt. He had done what he could. It was understanding, and understanding, he knew, was heavier to bear than remorse. One evening in March, as the city began to thaw from its long winter, a letter arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres. The handwriting was unfamiliar, deliberate, careful. It had been forwarded from Le Havre, its corners smudged from handling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in the same elegant hand as the telegrams that had drawn her victims to Paris. "Inspector, you once said that peace is not found, but accepted. You were right, but there are still others who have not accepted it. If you want to know what truly happened before the firm collapsed, ask at the river port in Le Havre. Ask for Morel. He knew everything, and he has waited too long to speak. A friend of the truth." Maigret folded the letter, slipped it into his coat, and stared out at the rain-smeared city. For a long while he did not move. Then slowly he reached for his hat. Le Havre met him with the smell of the sea and the cry of gulls. The docks stretched wide and grey, cranes moving against the mist like skeletal sentinels. The name Morel was not unfamiliar. Maigret remembered it from the old company ledgers, an accountant, dismissed quietly just before the scandal broke. He found the man in a riverside tavern, its windows fogged from the warmth within. Morel was older than Maigret expected, his face lined by years of drink and disappointment. When the inspector sat across from him, he did not seem surprised. "I knew she'd send someone," Morel said, before Maigret had spoken a word. "Annette Delvaux?" Morel nodded, eyes unfocused. "She came here last year, before it all began. Sat right where you are. Asked me about the shipments, the missing funds. I told her the truth, that it was Roussel and Marchand who started it, but it was Leroux who kept it going." She listened quietly. When I finished, she said, "That's all I needed to know." "You didn't tell anyone?" Maigret asked. Morel gave a hollow laugh. "Who would I tell? The police? The bosses who signed my dismissal papers? I tried once, but no one wanted the story. Too small to matter, too old to prosecute. And besides," he added with a shrug, "what good does the truth do when no one's listening?" Maigret lit his pipe, the flame catching briefly in the dim light. "Sometimes it helps the dead rest," he said. Morel leaned back, studying him. "You think she found rest?" "She found something close enough." They talked for over an hour. By the time Maigret left, the tide had turned, the docks beginning to glisten under a new rain. He walked along the wharf until he reached the end, where the sea met the mouth of the Seine. There he stopped and looked out toward the horizon, where water and sky dissolved into one another. He thought of Annette again, of her quiet certainty, the deliberate grace with which she had orchestrated justice on her own terms. In another world, she might have been a judge, a philosopher, a poet. But in this one, she had been a woman without power who found her only strength in vengeance, disguised as truth. When Maigret returned to Paris 2 days later, the city felt strangely lighter, as if the air itself had shifted. He slept for 12 hours straight, something he hadn't done in months. In the morning, he awoke to the sound of Madame Maigret setting out coffee and bread. "There's a letter for you," she said, nodding toward the table. "From the ministry, I think." He opened it slowly, scanning the contents. A commendation for service, signed by a hand he didn't recognize. Exemplary conduct in resolving the Liège-Paris investigation. He folded it neatly and set it aside. "They're too kind," he said dryly. Madame Maigret smiled softly. "You never seem happy when they praise you." "I'm not unhappy," he said, "just unconvinced." Later that day, he walked once more to the river. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, the sun scattering shards of gold across the Seine. He stood by the parapet near Pont-Marie, where the water caught the light like molten glass. A barge passed below, leaving ripples that shimmered briefly before fading. He thought of all the cases he had solved and all the ones he hadn't. The guilty punished, the innocent freed, the stories half told. But this one was different. It had not been about law or order, but about the fragile architecture of conscience, and how easily it could crumble beneath the weight of silence. In the end, there were no villains left to arrest, no heroes to celebrate, only people, ordinary, fallible, burdened by choices they could not undo. He dropped the letter from Le Havre into the river. It floated for a moment before, sinking beneath the current, vanishing into the city's bloodstream. The clock on the cathedral struck 10. The sound carried faintly across the water, and as he turned to leave, he thought he heard the echo of another chime, softer, almost imagined. 10:47. Maigret smiled to himself. "Goodbye, Madame Delvaux," he said quietly. "You can rest now." Then he walked away, his silhouette swallowed by the crowd, leaving behind only the river, the smoke of his pipe, and the city that never stopped watching. Spring returned to Paris without ceremony, like a visitor slipping quietly back into a familiar room. The chestnuts along the boulevards began to bloom, their pale flowers bright against the soot-dark facades, and the air carried the faint smell of wet stone mixed with tobacco and lilac. It was in that soft, deceptive calm that Maigret found himself walking again by the Seine, not as an investigator, but as a man who had seen too much of the private architecture of other people's hearts. The Delvaux case, as it came to be known among his colleagues, had been neatly archived, sealed, and forgotten. The prefecture, in its infinite appetite for order, had even cited it as an example of effective closure. There was irony in that phrase. The only closure it had brought was the closing of a file drawer. The living, Maigret knew, never closed anything. They only learned to walk beside it. He passed the newspaper kiosks along the quay, the headlines shouting new scandals, new names, new tragedies. Each story would burn bright and fade, leaving behind nothing but its shadow. That was the rhythm of the city, one life ending, another beginning, all of it absorbed into the same endless hum. He stopped before a cafe whose window had fogged with morning condensation. The smell of roasting coffee and damp newsprint hung in the air. He entered, nodding to the waiter who recognized him. "Café? As usual, Monsieur Maigret? Yes, but strong today. He sat by the window, watching the street come to life, delivery carts rattling past, children in blue coats darting between puddles, a woman walking her dog beneath an umbrella far too small for the rain. Life persisted, untroubled by the ghosts that still walked beside it. When the coffee arrived, he let it sit untouched for a while. His pipe remained unlit on the table. He reached instead into his pocket and drew out a small object, a brass pocket watch, worn and heavy, the glass slightly cracked. It was not his own. It had been found among Annette Delvau's few possessions, and for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, he had kept it. The hands were frozen, as she had left them, at 10:47. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the cool metal against his palm. What had that moment meant to her? A reckoning, a confession, a line drawn between before and after. Perhaps it was simply the minute she chose to stop pretending the world could forgive itself. He wondered whether she had been afraid. Somehow he doubted it. Across the street, a man was selling old books from a cart, his wares covered with a plastic sheet against the drizzle. The sight stirred something in Maigret. Not nostalgia exactly, but a faint sense of continuity. He paid for his coffee and stepped outside, his hat pulled low, his coat collar turned up. The bookseller greeted him cheerfully. "Inspector, you've caught me before the tourists come to ruin my peace. Looking for anything in particular?" Maigret smiled. "Only something honest." He ran his hand over the spines of worn volumes, Balzac, Maupassant, Simenon's contemporaries, names that belonged to an older, slower France. He paused at a small notebook bound in brown leather. The pages inside were filled with careful handwriting, the ink faded to sepia. A diary, perhaps, or a confession. "Found it near the river last month," the bookseller said. "Someone's forgotten story." Maigret opened to the first page. "Le silence est plus lourd que le crime." Silence is heavier than crime. He closed the book, paid the man, and slipped it into his pocket beside the watch. That evening, back in his flat on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the city lights flickering beyond the curtains, he sat in his armchair while Madame Maigret mended a seam in quiet contentment. The air smelled of stew and rain and comfort. He opened the notebook and began to read. It wasn't Annette's hand. The dates were older, a decade past, yet the words felt familiar. The same cadence of resignation, the same careful precision of someone who had thought too long about guilt. He read until the lines blurred, until the meaning dissolved into the rhythm of the handwriting. He closed the book gently. "Do you believe," he asked, without looking up, "that people can ever truly atone?" Madame Maigret looked over from her chair, needle paused. "For what?" "For anything," he said. "For the things we do, or fail to do." She smiled softly, the kind of smile that had kept him anchored all these years. "Perhaps not," she said. "But they can live kindly afterward. That must count for something." He nodded, leaning back, his eyes half closed. The ticking of the wall clock filled the room. Steady, patient, alive. Outside, the city sighed through its chimneys and rain gutters, 1,000 unseen lives moving quietly beneath the same sky. Later, long after she had gone to bed, Maigret stood by the window once more. The river was a dark ribbon beneath the street lamps, its surface broken by the drifting light of a barge. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to chime the hour. He checked the frozen watch in his hand. 10:47. He let it rest on the sill and watched as the fog rose slowly, swallowing the lights of the opposite bank. The city was breathing as it always did. The The same river that had witnessed Annette's sorrow carried away the remnants of countless others. Maigret wondered if, in time, even the river forgot, or if, beneath its restless surface, it remembered everything. He turned away at last, extinguishing the lamp. The room filled with the quiet hum of night, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full, of memory, of humanity, of unfinished stories. Tomorrow there would be another case, another mystery, another life unraveling. But tonight the inspector allowed himself the rare comfort of stillness. Not peace, perhaps, but something that resembled it closely enough. And outside, beneath the bridges of Paris, the water kept its secrets, whispering softly against the stones as the city slept. Fin.